You're doing everything you were told would lead to a stable life. You work full-time, maybe two incomes in the household. You track your spending, cancel subscriptions you don't use, skip vacations, compare grocery prices, and still, somehow, by the last week of the month, the money is just gone. Not because of reckless spending, not because of luxury habits, but because the basic math of living quietly stopped working. If that feels familiar, it's not a personal failure, and it's not just happening to you. Across the developed world, millions of working families are experiencing the exact same paradox. They are earning more money than people did a generation ago, yet they feel financially tighter than ever before. On paper, inflation looks manageable. Official numbers often hover around 2 or 3%. That sounds like a slightly higher grocery bill, not something capable of destabilizing an entire household budget. But those numbers hide a much more uncomfortable reality. The prices rising fastest are not the optional things people can cut back on. They're the unavoidable ones. Housing, childcare, health insurance, education, transportation, the costs required just to participate in normal life. And when the essentials rise faster than wages, the system quietly creates something dangerous. A permanent gap between what people earn and what it costs simply to exist. Economists sometimes call this a cost of living squeeze, but that phrase doesn't capture what it actually feels like on the ground. Because when you live inside that squeeze, it doesn't show up as a single dramatic crisis. It shows up as a slow, relentless pressure. The emergency fund that never quite grows, the credit card balance that never fully disappears, the delayed doctor appointment, the home purchase that keeps getting pushed further into the future. In surveys conducted over the last few years, a majority of working adults say they feel financially stressed despite being employed full-time. That contradiction should raise a bigger question than it usually does. If people are working, budgeting, and still falling behind, then maybe the problem isn't personal spending habits at all. Maybe the cost of a normal life has fundamentally changed. And once you start looking closely, a pattern begins to emerge. Not one problem, but several forces moving at the same time. Forces that individually look manageable, but together create a financial environment that is far more difficult than the one previous generations faced. Today we're going to walk through 6 of those forces. Not theories, not speculation, real structural changes that have quietly reshaped the financial reality of working families. Housing that disconnected from wages, childcare costs that rival mortgage payments, education debt that follows people for decades, health insurance that protects against catastrophe but steadily drains income, a fee economy designed to make prices look smaller than they actually are, and an automated economy that increased efficiency without passing those benefits back to the people doing the work. Individually, each one is frustrating. Together, they explain why so many households feel like they're running faster every year just to stay in the same place. But before we go through them, there's one idea to keep in mind, because it changes how you see everything that follows. The most dangerous part of what's happening today isn't simply that life has become more expensive. It's that millions of people are being forced to spend money even when they're actively trying not to. And once you see how that works, you'll never look at your monthly budget the same way again. To understand how this plays out in real life, imagine a household that would sound perfectly stable to most people. Marcus is a high school teacher. Jennifer is a physical therapist. They're both in their mid-30s. They have 2 young kids and live in a normal mid-sized American city. Not New York, not San Francisco, just a place where most people assume life should still be reasonably affordable. Between the two of them, they earn about $91,000 a year before taxes. At first glance, that sounds like the kind of income that should support a middle-class life. 2 professionals, 2 paychecks, responsible careers. The kind of situation older generations often point to as proof that stability is achievable if you make the right choices. But once taxes come out, their combined take-home pay drops to roughly $6,100 per month. That's the actual amount available to run the household. Now look at the expenses. Their rent for a modest 2-bedroom apartment is about $2,050. Not luxury housing, just a normal place with enough room for 4 people to live without feeling cramped. Groceries for a family of 4 average around $1,050 a month. That's not restaurant spending or expensive specialty foods. Just basic weekly trips to the store. Health insurance through Jennifer's employer costs about $1,120 each month for the family plan. Child care for 2 kids at a licensed full-time facility runs roughly $2,250 a month. Then there's transportation. 1 car payment, fuel, maintenance, and insurance together come to around $640. Utilities and internet add another $270. And finally, student loan payments from the degrees that made their careers possible total about $460 per month. When you add all of that together, Their fixed monthly costs reach approximately $7,740. Their take-home income is $6,100. That leaves a gap of $1,640 every single month. And that number is before anything unexpected happens. Before a child gets sick. Before a tire blows out on the highway. Before the washing machine stops working. Before birthdays, school supplies, or replacing clothes the kids outgrow every few months. Marcus and Jennifer are not eating at expensive restaurants. They're not taking international vacations. They're not buying luxury products. Almost every dollar they spend goes toward the most basic components of modern life: housing, food, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and education. The core infrastructure of an ordinary family. And it still doesn't add up. When a household runs a deficit like that month after month, the financial problem stops being temporary. It becomes structural. The budget doesn't occasionally break, it starts every month already broken. At that point, there are only a few ways to close the gap. Savings, if there are any, slowly disappear. Expenses get cut further, often in areas like medical care or retirement contributions that people shouldn't really be sacrificing. Or the most common solution begins to appear. Credit. A credit card covers the shortfall in October. A small personal loan absorbs the holiday expenses in December. A payment plan handles a medical bill the following spring. None of those decisions feel irresponsible in the moment. In fact, they're often the most rational choice available. Missing rent or skipping a necessary doctor visit isn't really an option. So the household borrows time. But borrowing time comes with interest. And once that interest becomes part of the monthly budget, next month's math becomes even tighter than the last. This is the quiet financial reality millions of working families now live inside. The system has already anticipated the gap and built a solution for it. It will lend you the difference. With interest, which leads to a question that sits underneath everything we're about to discuss. If the fastest rising costs in the economy are the ones people have absolutely no ability to cut, can we honestly keep calling this a personal spending problem? Because when you zoom out, Marcus and Jennifer's situation isn't unusual anymore. It's becoming increasingly typical, and that's where the first structural force begins: housing. For decades, owning a home was considered the single most reliable path to financial stability. Work hard, save for a down payment, buy a house, and over time that house becomes an asset, something that grows in value and builds long-term security. For a long time, that formula genuinely worked. But the math behind it has quietly changed. And once you see how dramatically it changed, it becomes clear why housing has become the single biggest pressure point in modern household budgets. If the fastest rising costs in the economy are the ones people have absolutely no ability to cut, can we honestly keep calling this a personal spending problem? Because when you zoom out, Marcus and Jennifer's situation isn't unusual anymore. It's becoming increasingly typical, and that's where the first structural force begins: housing. For decades, owning a home was considered the single most reliable path to financial stability. Work hard, save for a down payment, buy a house, and over time that house becomes an asset, something that grows in value and builds long-term security. For a long time, that formula genuinely worked. But the math behind it has quietly changed. And once you see how dramatically it changed, it becomes clear why housing has become the single biggest pressure point in modern household budgets. For most of the last century, the foundation of middle-class financial security rested on one simple idea: work steadily, save what you can, and eventually buy a home. That home wasn't just a place to live, it was a long-term asset. As the mortgage slowly got paid down and the property value slowly climbed, families built equity, wealth that could later help pay for retirement, education, or emergencies. It was the financial ladder millions of households climbed, one generation after the next. And for a long time, the numbers made that ladder reachable. In the mid-1980s, the typical home in the United States cost roughly 3 to 4 times the median household income. That ratio matters because it tells you how realistic ownership actually is. When a home costs 3.5 years of total income, saving for a down payment and qualifying for a mortgage is difficult, but possible. A household can realistically work toward it over time. Fast forward to today, and the relationship between incomes and housing prices has shifted dramatically. In many parts of the country, the median home price is now 7 to 9 times the median household income. In high-demand cities, that ratio climbs into double digits. Suddenly, the same ladder that previous generations climbed has been stretched twice as tall. Even before you consider interest rates, the entry point alone has moved much further away. The practical effect is simple. Many families that would have bought a home in earlier decades are now forced to rent for much longer than they planned. Some stay in smaller apartments than they prefer. Others move farther away from their workplaces, trading lower rent for longer commutes. And many end up spending significantly more than the long-standing guideline that housing should consume no more than 30% of household income. That 30% rule, by the way, was established decades ago when the price-to-income ratio looked completely different. In a world where housing costs 2 or 3 times more relative to earnings, the rule quietly stopped matching reality, but it was never fully replaced with a new one. For households like Marcus and Jennifer, this creates a financial paradox. Renting keeps the roof over their heads, but every rent payment disappears the moment it's made. It doesn't build equity. It doesn't create an asset. It simply keeps the household stable for another month. Meanwhile, people who already own property benefit from rising home values. As prices climb, their net worth increases automatically. The home they purchased years ago becomes more valuable even if nothing about the house itself changes. That difference between owning and trying to enter the market slowly widens the gap between two groups of people. Those who bought earlier continue building wealth through property appreciation, while those trying to enter later face a higher and higher barrier every year. Housing, in other words, has quietly become one of the strongest engines of wealth inequality. Not because someone designed it that way, but because the math drifted so far from where it once was. But housing alone doesn't explain why household budgets feel so strained. The next force is less visible but often just as expensive. It's something millions of families pay every month simply to keep 2 incomes in the household. And strangely enough, it's paired with a bill from decisions made nearly 2 decades earlier. Childcare and student debt. 2 completely different costs from 2 completely different moments in life, yet together they create one of the most powerful financial traps modern families face. The next pressure point in the modern household budget is something that doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, often years apart, until 2 completely different financial obligations collide at the exact same moment in a family's life. On one side is childcare. On the other is student debt. They come from different chapters of adulthood. One is tied to raising children. The other traces back to decisions made at 18 years old. Yet both share a critical feature that makes them especially difficult to escape. They are costs you pay simply to participate in the modern economy. Start with childcare. For most families with young children, full-time childcare isn't optional. It's the price of maintaining 2 incomes. Without it, one parent often has to leave the workforce entirely or reduce hours significantly. And in a world where housing, healthcare, and education costs have already climbed, losing one paycheck usually isn't a workable option. So families pay. In many parts of the United States, full-time licensed childcare for 2 young children typically falls somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500 per month, depending on the state and the facility. In some areas, it's even higher. Think about what that number means in practical terms. In many regions, that monthly bill rivals or even exceeds a mortgage payment. Families are effectively paying the cost of a home every month just to be able to go to work. The most honest way to think about it is this. Childcare has become a kind of participation fee in the labor market. If both parents want to earn income, the system charges a monthly toll. If you can afford it, you keep both incomes. If you can't, one income disappears. And that financial setback tends to hit middle and lower income households the hardest. Now layer student debt on top of that. For many people who attended college, the monthly payment on student loans ranges somewhere between $350 and $500 per person, though the exact amount varies widely depending on the size of the loans and repayment plan. In households where both partners went to college, that can mean $700 to $900 every month, leaving the budget before anything else gets paid. Unlike childcare, which at least serves a current purpose, student loan payments often feel like a bill from the past. It's money being paid today for a decision made years earlier, usually under a widely repeated promise. Borrow for education now, and the increased earning potential will make it worthwhile later. For many graduates, the degree did lead to better jobs, but the financial payoff hasn't always matched the cost of the loans required to get there. And here's where the situation becomes even more complicated. Student debt doesn't just take money out of the monthly budget. It also affects something lenders watch very closely when deciding whether someone qualifies for a mortgage: the debt-to-income ratio. That ratio measures how much of a household's income is already committed to paying debt. When the number is too high, lenders become reluctant to approve a mortgage. So the loans that were supposed to enable better careers and eventually home ownership sometimes end up becoming the very thing that delays buying a home. In other words, the investment meant to build the future can end up standing in the way of it. When you combine the two costs, childcare and student loans, the monthly impact can easily land somewhere between $2,700 and $3,400 for a typical dual-income household with young children. That's comparable to a second mortgage. Except unlike a home loan, these payments rarely build any lasting asset. They simply reset every month. Scale that experience across millions of households at the same time, and the broader effects begin to appear. Couples delay having children because the financial math doesn't feel safe. Families postpone buying homes because saving for a down payment becomes nearly impossible. Milestones that once marked the transition into stable adulthood begin drifting further and further into the future. Individually, each household is just trying to stay afloat. Collectively, the pattern reshapes how an entire generation builds wealth, or struggles to. But even these visible expenses, housing, childcare, education, don't fully explain the stress people feel around money. Because the next force works in a completely different way. It's something people pay for every month, yet when the moment comes to actually use it, many hesitate. Not because they don't need it, but because they're afraid of what it might cost. Most people think of health insurance as something you buy to pay for medical care. That's the simple explanation most of us grow up with. You pay a monthly premium, and when you get sick or injured, the insurance covers the cost. But for many families today, that's not really what health insurance feels like anymore. What they're actually paying for is protection from financial catastrophe, because modern health insurance isn't designed to eliminate medical bills. It's designed to prevent those bills from becoming completely devastating. And that difference changes how households experience the cost. Take a typical employer-sponsored family plan. Around the middle of the last decade, many families were paying somewhere in the range of $400 to $500 per month for coverage through work. It was still expensive, but it remained within the boundaries of what most middle-class budgets could manage. Fast forward roughly 10 years, and that same category of coverage in many cases now costs over $1,000 per month in premiums alone. In some households, it's even higher depending on the employer contribution and plan structure. That's an increase that has significantly outpaced wage growth during the same period. While household incomes did rise, they did not rise anywhere near fast enough to keep up with the cost of maintaining health coverage. And that monthly premium is only the beginning. Modern health plans usually include deductibles, the amount you must pay out of pocket before insurance begins covering a portion of the costs. After the deductible is met, there are often co-pays, co-insurance percentages, and occasionally additional bills from specialists or labs that may fall outside the provider network. To someone navigating the system for the first time, the structure can feel incredibly complex. The result is that families frequently discover the real cost of care only after the treatment has already happened. A hospital visit might generate multiple separate charges. The facility itself bills for the room, the physician bills for the service. The radiologist who reviewed imaging may send a separate bill entirely. And if any one of those providers happens to fall outside the network defined by the insurance plan, the cost can change dramatically. So households begin doing something that would have seemed strange a generation ago. They start calculating whether they can afford to use the coverage they're already paying for. Is this pain serious enough to justify the deductible? Should we wait a few days before seeing the doctor? Can the follow-up appointment be postponed until next year when the insurance resets? These aren't medical decisions. They're financial ones. When millions of families find themselves weighing health against household budgets, it signals something deeper than a typical price increase. It means the cost of protection itself has become a major financial burden. Think about what $1,100 per month represents in opportunity cost for a household budget. You don't use over a single year. That's more than $13,000, and still money that could otherwise build an emergency fund, contribute to retirement investments, not because of or reduce other debts, not because of luxury habits. It's spent on the possibility of avoiding financial disaster if something goes wrong. To be clear, modern medicine has achieved extraordinary things across the developed world. Treatments exist today that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. But the financial structure surrounding that system has grown increasingly complicated and expensive, and the families writing the monthly check often feel caught in the middle, paying steadily rising premiums while still facing large out-of-pocket costs if they actually need care. So the household budget tightens again. But housing takes a large portion, childcare takes another, student debt claims its share, health insurance quietly grows year after year. A hospital visit might generate multiple multiple separate charges.
Transportation,
The facility itself bills for the room.
Just to participate
The physician
in normal
bills
life.
for the
And when
service.
essentials rise
The
faster than
radiologist who
wages,
reviewed
the system
imaging may
quietly
send a
creates
separate
something
bill
dangerous,
entirely.
a
And
permanent
if
gap
any one of
between
those
what people
providers
earn
happens to
and what it
fall
costs
outside the
simply
network
to
defined by
exist.
the insurance plan,
Economists sometimes
the
call
cost
this a
can
cost of
change
living
dramatically.
squeeze, but that phrase
So
doesn't
households
capture what
begin
it
doing
actually
something
feels
that would
like
have
on the
seemed
ground.
strange a
Because when you
generation
live
ago.
inside that
They
squeeze,
start
it doesn't
calculating
show
whether
up
they
as
can
a
afford to
single
use the
dramatic
coverage they're
crisis.
already
It shows
paying
up
for.
as a slow,
Is this pain
relentless
serious
pressure.
enough to
The
justify the
emergency fund that
deductible?
never quite
Should we
grows.
wait a few
The
days
credit
before
card
seeing the
balance
doctor?
that never fully
Can the
disappears.
follow-up
The
appointment
delayed
be
doctor
postponed
appointment,
until
the
next
home
year when the
purchase that
insurance
keeps getting
resets?
pushed further into
These
the
aren't
future.
medical decisions. They're financial ones. When millions of families find themselves weighing health against household budgets, it signals something deeper than a typical price increase. It means the cost of protection itself has become a major financial burden. Think about what a $1,100 per month represents in opportunity cost for a household budget. Over a single year, that's more than $13,000. Money that could otherwise build an emergency fund, contribute to retirement investments, or reduce other debts. Instead, it's spent on the possibility of avoiding financial disaster if something goes wrong. To be clear, modern medicine has achieved extraordinary things. Treatments exist today that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. But the financial structure surrounding that system has grown increasingly complicated and expensive. And the families writing the monthly check often feel caught in the middle, paying steadily rising premiums while still facing large out-of-pocket costs if they actually need care. So the household budget tightens again. Housing takes a large portion. Childcare takes another. Student debt claims its share. Health insurance quietly grows year after year. At this point, the financial pressure begins to produce something new, a gap. Not a catastrophic one that appears overnight, but a smaller structural gap between income and expenses that repeats month after month. Sometimes it's a few $100s. Sometimes it's a little more. But over time, that gap becomes the most important financial force in the household. Because once the math stops working, the system already has a solution waiting: credit. And when that solution becomes permanent rather than temporary, the entire financial landscape starts to change.